Welcome to this week's edition of Taiwan Outlook. I'm your host, Chi-Chen Lo. In today's program, we are very delighted to invite Mr. Stephen Yates to come to our program to share with us his views about the relationship between Taiwan and the U.S. Mr. Yates is currently the president of DC Asia Advisery, a very well-known policy and public affairs consulting firm in the Washington, D.C. area. And as we know that before he joined the government in the year 2001 to 2005, as the Deputy Assistant to Vice President Cheney's Office for National Security Affairs, he was a senior analyst at the Heritage Foundation, a very important think tank in the States. Mr. Yates, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Good. As we know that the new de facto Taiwan's ambassador to the States just arrived in Washington, D.C. How do you read the new appointment?
Well, Joseph Wu is well known in Washington. In his previous job as chairman of the Mainland Affairs Council, he's traveled to Washington several times and had discussions with government officials and also people outside of government. And so it's very helpful that people already know his personality, his outlook, that he's very energetic and enthusiastic, but also very committed to advancing Taiwan's objectives. And so I think he's going to be generally well received.
As we know that Joseph Wu is the first ever diplomat or ambassador from Taiwan from the ruling DPP. How do you read that?
Well, I think it's only appropriate that at some point during an 8-year tenure of a DPP president, he might be able to appoint a member of his party to represent him in what I would argue is the most important capital in the world outside of Taipei.
Yeah. And but as you know that there are some structural constraints in terms of communication channels between Taiwan and the U.S. Will he be able to, improve or upgrade relations between Taiwan and the U.S. in such a short time?
Well, structurally, I don't anticipate that his appointment changes the way the U.S. and Taiwan deal with one another. I mean, we're still going to be having communications go through TECRO to the other parts of the U.S. government, and we're still going to have communication coming from the United States through AIT here in Taipei. There have been communication issues in the past. Sometimes communication issues are because we don't have the right people talking to each other. But sometimes we have communication issues because one side or the other doesn't want to hear what is being said. And so I think that Joseph will succeed in being able to engage effectively with his interlocutors in Washington. He will talk to the right people, but it's really up to the government here in Taipei to give him the content to improve the quality of the dialogue with the United States.
Speaking of content, what do you think should be on the top of the agenda when our new ambassador, Joseph Wu, engage with his counterparts in the States?
Well, he needs to reflect the priorities of the government that sent him. But I think his first order of business is to establish himself in his new capacity. He needs to make a round of courtesy calls to people, make an introduction to them in his new job, and basically have what some politicians do when newly elected, conduct a listening tour. Go and meet with many different constituencies and give them a chance to tell you what they think you need to know as the new representative in Washington. And after he's had that good kind of a listening tour and consult back with President Chen and other leaders in Taipei, then he can get a very clear sense of what his priorities are and what's achievable in the near term.
What are the major issues now lying in the relationship between Taiwan and the U.S.?
Well, I think there's an ongoing issue where the U.S. government seeks assurances from Taiwan's leadership about the kinds of issues that are going to be put forward either by candidates seeking election or by leaders who remain in office, like President Chen. And so I think this issue of having some kind of an assurance that the U.S. government has an idea of the direction leaders want to take Taiwan, the kinds of policies and initiatives leaders intend to propose, and to give the United States a sense of why these issues are important and why it is manageable to deal with changes that people might want to propose.
Some people argue that as a result of President's recent statements about the so-called 5 no's or 4 yes and so on, and the relationship between Taiwan and the U.S. now is at its lowest point. Do you think that's the case?
Well, I think there's probably evidence on both sides of this ledger. There clearly have been experiences in recent years that have led people in Washington to have concern about the direction Taiwan appears to be going. But there are also, we'd have to say, some pretty strong fundamentals in the relationship between the United States and Taiwan. There is a deep respect among Americans who are familiar with Asia and familiar with Taiwan for the success of Taiwan democracy over the years. But democracy brings with it an element of uncertainty, and that makes people uncomfortable sometimes. And so that raises the challenge in helping people feel comfortable that Taiwan's democracy is moving in a direction that is consistent with U.S. interests and concerns, and something that the United States can be proud to support. But I think that's where the communication challenge comes in. Taiwan, when it has an open democracy, can speak with many voices, and candidates can say many different kinds of things. Leaders can promote ideas, but they have to get passed through the legislature or other thresholds to become law and come into effect in Taiwan. And so it's a new balancing act. It's not like it was in the past when one party basically controlled all parts of government, and if the top leader decided something, it was going to happen. So the United States is having to adjust, and Taiwan is having to adjust with the uncertainty that the United States might feel. And the United States remains very deeply committed to other parts of the world, and unlike times in the past, might feel special pressure to avoid uncertainty and tensions in this part of the world while we're preoccupied elsewhere.
Okay. To some extent, the intergovernmental relationship reflect the interpersonal relationship between leaders. But some people believe that, unfortunately, there's a lack of mutual trust between the leaders of these two countries. Do you think that is still the case now?
Well, I think this is one of the structural challenges in U.S.-Taiwan relations. The President of the United States doesn't get to have a personal relationship with the President of Taiwan. And the President of Taiwan doesn't get to have a personal relationship with the President of the United States. The President of Taiwan is not allowed to visit the United States and have official meetings and official locations with top officials. And so this is a challenge. And so both sides only get an impression of the other leader through meetings with their representatives, through written communication, and through media and other kinds of means. And so it is a weakness in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. And so I would be shy about saying whether the personal relationship between the two leaders is particularly strong or particularly weak. I don't think there is a personal relationship between the two leaders. But there has been some question on the American side about President Chun's intentions and whether he understands and respects U.S. needs for caution and calm in this part of the world. And on the Taiwan side, I think there's been a degree of concern about the perceived harshness from time to time of statements made by the U.S. side in reaction to events in Taiwan. So to the degree that that's a function of the personal relationship, that is an issue that remains a challenge to deal with, and that Joseph in Washington is going to have to work hard on that, and Steve Young here in Taipei has to work hard on that.
But short of interpersonal relationship between the two presidents, some sort of high-level context between the two sides is also very critical in stabilizing and improving the relations. Do you think that the current high-level official context between the two sides are enough and are, efficient?
The structures that we have to work with between the two governments, unofficially, of course, since we don't say we do official business with the government of Taiwan, but the channels of communication are there. I think the challenge really is improving the quality of the content of those communication channels. Of course, in an ideal world, it would make more sense for democratic leaders in Taiwan to be able to interact directly with elected leaders in the United States. Politicians understand what the competing forces are that weigh on other political leaders in ways that professionals in bureaucracies and government never can really fully appreciate. And so it would be to Taiwan and perhaps the United States advantage to be able to have these more open and direct channels of communication. But the U.S. has chosen for policy reasons for several decades now not to have those channels open with Taiwan.
Let's talk about some of the major pillars to the U.S. policy towards the Taiwan Strait, one China policy. And as a result of the rising Taiwanese identity, some people believe that it's about time for the U.S. to change or even to modify its one China policy. Do you agree with that, this kind of one China policy, and what are the major problems as resulting from this one China policy, U.S. one China policy?
Right. Well, I think one of the biggest challenges in the one China policy is trying to say what it means. If you ask a government spokesman, they will give you a very crisp series of sentences as an explanation, but they're filled with words that also contain ambiguity. Words like the status quo. Well, what is the status quo? And so inherent in this, there are some difficulties with the ambiguity of what we say we seek. And undoubtedly there have been changes in the world, in this region, in China, and in Taiwan that warrant having a discussion about possible adjustments to policy. I don't think it's likely or possible for the United States to adopt a policy that's called something other than the one China policy. But if there's an interest in having a discussion about how the one China policy is interpreted and implemented, perhaps that's an area that's worth time for people to explore. But I think it's probably not going to be effective or helpful to Taiwan's interest to have a major campaign to demand a different name for the policy.
Steve, you mentioned the policy concept of the so-called status quo. But as we know that in reality, there's no such a thing as status quo. Everything is changing every day, including the number of missiles deployed by the PRC and the so-called rising Taiwanese identity and so on. Do you think the U.S. policy of status quo is a sound and effective policy in maintaining stability in the Taiwan Strait?
I think that the whole concept of status quo is a little bit vague. And it's definitely true, and I think officials on all sides know that it's a dynamic region, that things are constantly changing in Taiwan and constantly changing in China. They are in the United States too. And that it's also true that China is taking measures to alter the status quo in its favor when it comes to what's happening in Taiwan in particular and also in the region. I think it's more constructive to focus on what do we really mean by these words. And I think what the U.S. side means by these words is that we don't want time and resources to be taken away from the priorities that we're struggling with or trying to push in other parts of the world. And so if we're trying to deal with Iran, Iraq, North Korea, energy security, and things like this, we do not necessarily want to have an issue in Taiwan come up that takes time and resources away or complicates resolution of these other problems. And so it's not a question of saying there should be no change in Taiwan. And certainly the United States isn't seeking a change in policy, but it's seeking a degree of predictability and stability in relations with Taiwan and trying to follow developments in this part of the world. Whether it's realistic to expect things to be calm and relatively unchanging, that's a different question. But I think that the policy, when people say the words status quo, what they really mean is please don't take time and resources away from these other priorities that we're spending a great deal of time and effort dealing with.
Okay. Another very important dimension to the U.S. policy is the so-called no mediation on the part of the U.S. But as we know that in recent years, there are rumors or arguments from the PRC side that Beijing wants to invite the U.S. to co-manage the issue of Taiwan independence. And our president recently just said that we are hoping to invite the U.S. to be part of the co-management in the Taiwan Strait issues. How do you respond to that kind of urges by both sides of the Taiwan Strait to try to get the U.S. involved?
Right. Well, it would be a departure from the 6 assurances that Ronald Reagan gave after signing the 1982 communique. But it's very, very clear that there are persistent voices from multiple sides of this, from Taipei, Washington, and Beijing, that suggest the United States has a role to play. And when it comes to Beijing and Taipei, both sides want the U.S. on their side, which is natural, I assume. I personally think that when it comes to dialogue and negotiations between both sides of the strait, I think it's very, very important, if Beijing is serious about unification and having a peaceful and sustainable relationship with the people of Taiwan, they have to come to terms with a way to deal with the Taiwan government. Because even if Taiwan someday were to choose to unify with China, there will need to be a government here that's dealing with the people, and they need to find a way to deal with the elected representatives of the Taiwan people. The party-to-party negotiations can't solve these differences. Speaking to the United States and having the United States talk to the leadership here can't solve these differences. They really need to find a way to bridge this communication gap and deal with the elected government here in Taiwan if they're serious about resolving those differences. So I don't think it's really helpful to suggest the United States try to sit in the middle and pull both sides together. But this is another example of how the Taiwan Strait is different from almost every other conflict zone in the world. We've had people go and be envoys to both sides of the dispute in Northern Ireland. We've had people go and try to mediate issues in the Middle East. So this is just an area where we have not particularly chosen to put ourselves in that position, and probably to get in the middle wouldn't help either side terribly much.
The bilateral relationship between Taiwan and the U.S. is related to, in some cases, it's a function of Sino-U.S. relations. So when we come back, we will talk about U.S. policy towards China. So we'll be back in a few moments. Stay with us.